Well, howdy everyone. Today I'm looking at one of the most well-known and popular of Canon's professional camera lenses, the venerable 24-70mm f2.8 USM L. This lens was recently discontinued by Canon, who released a new Mark II version of it and jacked up the price about 30%. Typical Canon. But despite being recently superseded by a new version, this is still the bread and butter lens of many professional photographers. And nowadays it's a little more affordable wherever you can still get it. Why is this class of lens so popular with the pros? Firstly, the lens's zoom range of 24-70mm, going from very wide angle to short telephoto, is ideal for all kinds of photography, from wide architecture shots to portrait work. And secondly, the f2.8 maximum aperture lets in a lot of light, giving you snappy shutter speeds and opening up low light photography and video work. Also, f2.8 can give you nice blurry backgrounds in your pictures. So the lens is super handy for all manner of work. The only downside really is the lack of image stabilization, which is a bit of a shame and definitely a letdown for handheld video work. Let's take a look at the lens's build quality. It's a bit of a tank. Anyone remember when the original Xbox came out and everyone was wondering why it was so big and heavy? That's this lens. It weighs almost a kilogram and it's pretty hefty, especially its huge but very efficient lens hood. It can use such an unusually deep lens hood because the front element of the lens extends as you zoom out, which is in reverse to every other zoom lens I've ever seen. Strange. But at least the zoom ring is extremely smooth. And so is the focus ring. It's very smooth, well damped and precise. As you'd expect for a Canon L lens, this lens has full-time manual focus, and the front element of the lens does not rotate as you focus. The lens is weather sealed with a gasket around the metal lens mount. Look at the unusual size of the rear glass element. It's huge. The autofocus on this lens is very quiet and very fast, if not quite instantaneous. It tested very accurately on my Canon 70D and 6D cameras. Overall, the lens is built just as you'd expect for this class of equipment. Beautifully well, just what any professional could need. Okay, let's look at picture quality. Right now, I have two 20-megapixel digital cameras here. A brand new Canon 70D with its smaller APS-C sensor, and a Canon 6D with its more expensive and bigger full-frame sensor. They both have peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction, which I've turned on. Well, the lens is designed for full-frame cameras and its 24-70mm zoom range is much better suited for them, so let's start with the full-frame Canon 6D. At 24mm and with the aperture open at f2.8, the lens is very sharp in the middle. Not the sharpest, but very good. The colours are quite neutral, but the levels of contrast are just average. The sharpness stays very good as you move into the corners, although in the extreme corners, all is blurriness. There's also a slight drop in contrast levels in the corners. Stop the lens down to f4 and then even further to f5.6 for a reasonable improvement in the corners, and the picture quality overall becomes very good. The middle of the frame remains nice and sharp. Well, let's zoom in to 35mm. We have basically the same situation. The lens is really nice and sharp in the middle of the frame, and the corners are also looking good, except for the very extreme corners, which really are weak. Stop down to f4 and everything looks even sharper, and at f5.6 even the extreme corners look good, and sharpness is extremely high from the corners right into the middle. Apart from right in those edges, image quality is fantastic at 35mm. Let's zoom in all the way to 70mm. It's nice and sharp, but you can get sharper lenses than this, and the contrast levels in the image are just okay. The corners of the image are okay, but nothing to write home about. When you stop down to f4, then the corners become a bit sharper, and at f5.6, the sharpness levels are good. The middle of the image is also much sharper now. So, what can we say overall? The original 24-70 f2.8L puts in a solid performance on a full-frame camera, although in a few areas it's showing its age. The extreme corners of its images are weak at wider angles, and at the telephoto end it's not quite the sharpest lens in the world. Also, contrast levels could be just a little better. But aside from that, it's still a very high resolution lens which does its job well. Well, let's look at how the lens performs on an APS-C camera with its smaller sensor. Here are some images from a 20 megapixel Canon 70D with peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration correction turned on. Let's start at 24mm with the aperture open at f2.8. The center of the image is reasonably sharp, but again, we're not seeing the best contrast levels. The corners of the image are about the same, reasonably sharp, right into the edges. There's a little improvement when you stop down to f4, and when we look back into the middle of the image, there's a tiny bit more sharpness and contrast. So at 24mm we see good, but not incredible picture quality. Let's zoom in to 35mm. We basically have the same situation here. The middle of the image is reasonably sharp, and so are the edges. There's a nice improvement at f4, and stop down to f5.6 for very sharp pictures in the corners, right back into the middle. Contrast levels are still only okay. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 70mm. At f2.8, sharpness and contrast levels are a little dull, and the corners are also pretty average. Stop down to f4 for a good improvement, and at f5.6 the corners are decently sharp, and the middle of the image is also looking really nice. So on an APS-C camera we see good picture quality, and sharpness is nice and even across the image frame, but still, it's a level of sharpness that doesn't particularly blow you away, especially the slightly weak contrast levels, and 70mm is a bit of a weak spot. Although the 24-70 is putting up a good fight, lenses made in this era simply weren't quite designed for the challenge of high-resolution APS-C digital cameras. Well, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting. As usual, because it's a full-frame lens, it's not really a problem on APS-C cameras, so let's take a look at the full-frame results. At 24mm we see moderate barrel distortion and strong vignetting, or darkness in the corners. Using peripheral illumination on your camera will help you out here, or stop the lens down to f4 for more brightness in the corners. At 35mm the distortion mostly straightens out, and at 70mm we see moderate pincushion distortion and, again, pretty strong vignetting in the corners. Again, stop down to f4 and the corners brighten up. Overall, it's a very average performance. There's definitely a bit more vignetting than I'd like to see, but at least you can get rid of it with peripheral illumination. For a lens of this class, the 24-70 can focus fairly closely to your subjects. At f2.8, the close-up image quality is a bit soft really, but stop down to f4 for decent sharpness levels, and it's very sharp at f5.6. If you're taking close-up pictures with this lens, then you'll definitely want to stop the aperture down a bit. The lens gives an average performance against bright lights, showing a little lack of contrast and some flaring, but only when bright lights are right there in the picture. Finally, let's look at this lens's bokeh, or the quality of the out-of-focus backgrounds. At 70mm, the out-of-focus areas look fairly smooth, but slightly clumpy. It's good enough though, without any serious problems, although the lens struggles a little in rendering complex backgrounds, as you can see here. The complex nature of the bokeh quality reminds me of the Canon 17-55mm f2.8 lens. It's nice enough, but a little bit trippy. At wider angles, such as 24mm, the bokeh quality is slightly rough looking. So ultimately, the Canon 24-70mm f2.8 USM L is still a nice lens today, and it's generally decently sharp, but in most other respects it didn't quite blow me away. In terms of vignetting and distortion, close-up picture quality, lens flaring and bokeh, it's simply not a very remarkable lens. It's just good. And on an APS-C camera, even the sharpness levels are a little bit louche. There may be some people who aren't happy with me saying that. After all, the 24-70 is quite a legendary lens for its time. But the simple fact is that, against today's newest lenses, it simply has a few flaws. Personally, instead of this lens, I'd rather use a few nice fast prime lenses. But at the end of the day, I can't imagine anyone being really unhappy with this lens. If it does what you need as a good quality, full frame, fast standard zoom lens, and you find it for a reasonable price, then I'm sure you'll get tons of good usage and great pictures out of it.